It's the Prison News broadcast now on Spreaker. Greetings and welcome to Prison News. I'm your host. First up, ex-lottery worker who rigged winnings gets 25 years in prison. A former lottery worker was sentenced to 25 years in prison on Tuesday for rigging the system in several states so he could collect the jackpots. Eddie Tipton, former security director of the Multi-State Lottery Association, received the maximum sentence from an Iowa judge who mentioned Tipton's greed in his sentencing.
"I certainly regret my actions," Tipton told the court. "It's difficult even saying that with all the people that I know behind me that I hurt."
Tipton pleaded guilty in June to a charge of ongoing criminal conduct for a scheme involving 7 lottery tickets in 5 states. According to court documents, he admitted to rigging computer codes to produce winning numbers. Tipton and his accomplices awarded themselves millions of dollars. Now, Tipton has agreed to pay about $2.2 million in restitution, including $1.1 million to the Colorado Lottery, $644,000 to the Oklahoma Lottery, $391,000 to the Wisconsin Lottery, and $30,000 to the Kansas Lottery. Now, you got to wonder how one guy can take down 5 different states that's supposed to have some of the highest security around. You got to wonder. Next up, white boy Rick Wersch, released from Michigan prison, now headed to Florida. A Detroit area man is headed to a Florida prison after 29 years in a Michigan prison for drug crimes as a teen. Rick Wersch, who was also known on the streets as White Boy Rick, was turned over to federal authorities Tuesday, 5 weeks after he was granted parole. The Michigan Corrections Department confirmed the release. Now, Wersch was behind bars when he was convicted in a Florida stolen car investigation 29 years ago. He says he felt forced to plead guilty to protect his mother and sister. He could be held in Florida for more than 2 years, although White Boy Wersch hopes he can get out sooner. Next, ex-trader to begin 2-year prison sentence for lying to customers. Now, a federal appeals court on Tuesday ordered the former Jeffries LLC trader to report to prison on September 12th to begin serving a 2-year sentence for lying to customers about mortgage bond prices. He is appealing his January conviction and has asked the Manhattan-based court to allow him to remain free until the case is resolved. That isn't what happened the first time around. In 2014, at his first trial for lying to customers, Litvak was convicted, but the appeals court allowed him to remain free during the appeal. The higher court later overturned the conviction, setting up, what they call the second trial. Litvak was the first of more than half a dozen traders charged in the government's crackdown on shady bond trading practices to ever go to trial. You folks may remember this guy. He was what they call, I think, the domino or the bowling pin or something. I returned to text. A former Nomura Holdings Incorporated trader accused of similar contact, Michael Gramis, was convicted in June of conspiracy and cleared of 6 fraud counts following a trial in Hartford, while one of his colleagues, Tyler Peters, was acquitted of all charges. Jurors cleared a third Nomura trader, Ross Shapiro, of 8 counts, but deadlocked on 1 conspiracy count. Prosecutors still have to decide whether to retry Grammons and Shapiro on the counts of which the jury was hung. Next, Palmdale couple sentenced to life in prison for toddler's beating death. Now, folks, I hate to read this one, but I mean, you're here at this podcast. You can hear what's really going on in the prisons today. What's going on right here, right now. I return to text. A Palmdale woman and her boyfriend were sentenced Monday to life in state prison for their brutal beating of the woman's 23-month-old son, who was left in a vegetative state for weeks before he died. Brandon Jarrell Williams, 27, was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison after he was found guilty of first-degree murder, torture, and assault on a child causing death. This, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. His 23-year-old girlfriend, Rosie Lee Wilson, was convicted of second-degree murder and child abuse and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Prosecutors said the fatal beating occurred August 21st, 2014, when Wilson left her son with Williams, her live-in boyfriend. Now, this has kind of been sanitized, folks. I've looked at roughly five different write-ups on this, reports. They all show the picture of her, but not one shows a picture of Jarrell Williams. I don't know why. Next is a famous one. You may remember this. Jenny Jones killer out of Michigan prison after murder of Scott Amender. Remember this one, folks? A convicted killer on one of the most infamous cases Michigan has ever seen will walk out of prison a free man. It has been more than 20 years since Scott Amender was killed after he appeared on the Jenny Jones Show. The man who ended Scott's life will now start living his own life outside of prison walls. Jonathan Schmitz had been convicted of second-degree murder in Almender's death. Frank Almender Jr., Scott's brother, said he still feels pain of Scott's murder and struggles with feelings. In March 1995, during a taping of the Jenny Jones Show, Scott revealed he had a crush on Jonathan Schmitz, who claimed not to be gay. 3 days later, Schmitz showed up at Scott's home in Lake Orion and shot and killed him. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, but was granted parole back in March. Well, folks, this is just a little taste of prison news. Boy, it's tough to read this stuff to you, but this is what's going on day after day after day in the prisons in the United States and Canada. Next up, we're going to go ahead and continue our look at McGuffy's Readers. Now, McGuffy's Readers are about 200 years old. Fantastic pedigree on these things, used to teach inmates, regular children, and even adults how to read nearly 200 years ago. How to read, how to write, how to do arithmetic. But the big kind of the take-home message is the actual stories that the kids read in these lessons. I've obtained some of the original transcripts of the McGuffy Readers. We're going to go ahead and read some of those now, as we've been doing. If you care to follow along here, it's called Prison News on Spreaker, spelled Spreaker podcast. Next, the story from the McGuffy Readers. McGuffy Readers story, The Himalayas. The Himalayas are the highest mountains on our globe. They are in Asia and separate India from Tibet. They extend in a continuous line for more than 1,000 miles. If you ever ascended one of these mountains from the plain below, you'll have to cross an unhealthy border approximately 20 miles in width. It is, in fact, a swamp caused by the waters overflowing the river banks. The soil of this swampy border is covered with trees and shrubs, where the tiger, the elephant, and other animals find secure retreat. Beyond this border, you will reach smiling valleys and noble forests. As you advance onward and upward, you will get among the more boulder and rugged scenes. The sides of the mountains are really quite steep, sometimes well wooded to quite a height, but sometimes quite barren. In crossing a river, you must be content with 3 ropes for a bridge. You'll find the streets of the towns are simply stairs cut out of the rocks, and you see the houses rising as you go up these stairs. The pathways into Tibet among these mountains are mere tracks by the side of foaming torrents below. Often, as you advance, you will find every trace of the path swept away by the falling of rocks and earth from above. Sometimes you will find posts driven to the mountainside upon which branches of trees and earth are spread. This forms a trembling foothold for the traveler. In the Andes and in South America, the sure-footed mule is used to carry travelers. Quite often, a chasm must be crossed that is many feet wide and hundreds of feet deep. The mule will leap across this chasm, but not until he is sure that he can make the jump safely. One day, says a traveler, I went by the worst pass over the Andes. The path for 70 yards was very narrow, and at one point it was entirely washed away. On one side of the rock, it was actually brushed my shoulder. On the other side, my foot overhung the precipice all the way down. The man told me that after we were safely over this pass, that to his knowledge, 400 mules had fallen over that very spot, and many travelers had lost their lives. Next Now, the McGuffy's readers in the class back then had a small poem that everyone read, and then they took out a slate and a piece of chalk, did just a little bit of work on what they heard, and then moved on to the next story. For authenticity's sake, we'll do the same thing. This is a very short poem, only 2 stanzas long. This is what they read 200 years ago to shape young minds. I read, God, make my life a little light within the world to glow, a little flame that burneth bright wherever I may go. God, make my life a little flower that giveth joy to all, content to bloom in native power, although its place be small. Poor, lame Jenny sat at her window looking out upon the dismal, narrow street with a look of pain and weariness on her face. Oh, dear, she said with a sigh, what a long day this is going to be, she said as she wishfully looked up the street. Suddenly she leaned forward and pressed her pale face against the glass as a rosy-cheeked boy came racing down the street, swinging his school books by the strap. Looking up to the window, he took off his hat and bowed with a bright and a pleasant smile. What a nice boy he is, said Jenny to herself as the boy ran out of sight. I am so glad he goes by here on his way to school. When he smiles, it seems like having the sunshine. I wish everybody who goes by would look up and smile.
Mama, said George Wist as he came home from school, I can't help but thinking about that poor little girl. I told you the other day, Mama, she looks so tired. I took off my hat and bowed down to her today. I wish I could do something for her.
Suppose you could carry her a handful of pretty flowers sometime when you go to school, said Mrs. West.
I'll do it. I'll do it tomorrow, said George. That is, if I can find my way into that rickety old house.
The next morning, as Jeannie sat leaning her weary head against the window and watching the raindrops chasing one another down the glass, she spied George with a handful of beautiful flowers carefully picking his way across the street. He stopped in front of her window and, smiling very pleasantly, said, How shall I find your room up there? Jenny pointed to an alley nearby where he turned in, and with some difficulty found his way to the dingy staircase. Opening the door to Jenny's gentle, Come in, he said,
I brought you a handful of flowers on this rainy day.
Oh, are they for me? Exclaimed Jenny, clapping her hands in delight. How kind you are, she continued as George laid them in her lap. I've not had a flower since we lived in the city.
Did you used to live in the country? Asked George.
Oh, yes, answered Jenny. We used to live in a beautiful cottage. There were trees and flowers and green grass, and the air was so sweet.
Well, what made you move here?
Oh, said Jenny, Papa died and Mama was sick so long that the money was all gone. Then Mama had to sell the cottage, and we moved here to try to get some work to do.
Do you have to sit here all day?
Asked George, glancing around the bare room and out into the dismal street. Yes, said Jenny, because I am lame. But I would not care for that if I could only help Mama.
I declare that's too bad,
said George, who dreaded nothing so much as being obliged to stay in the house.
Oh, no, it isn't,
said Jenny pleasantly. Mama says maybe we should forget the Lord if we had everything we wanted, and He never forgets us, you know.
Well, I must rush for school,
said George, not knowing exactly what to say next, and he was soon out of Jenny's sight, but he had a happy little corner in his heart because he had tried to do a kind act. He did not know how much good he had done in making a pleasant day out of a dreary one for that sick little girl.
Mama,
said George later that evening, after he had told her what Jenny had said,
Papa must give them some money so they can get back to their home.
No, said his mother. He cannot do that, for they would not wish him to do that. But perhaps he can assist them in some other, more comfortable way.
I'm going to carry Jenny some of the grapes Grandpa sent me tomorrow, said George, turning over the leaves of his geography. I'll put some of my pears into your basket. And then, Mom?
Yes, what I'll do, I'll go with you, said the mother. But there's one thing we can always give, and sometimes it does even more good than nice things to eat. Do you know what that is?
What is it, Mama?
Smiles, smiles, George was told, and as George looked up, he answered, "Yes, Mother, I know. It's a good plan to throw in a word or two of kindness at the same time."